Hello and welcome to the Anorak Review Show with your host, the Anorak. If my voice sounds a little bit off to you viewers, it's because I'm suffering another runny nose and my friends kind of try to tell me to kind of just put off doing another review. But I still want to keep my weekly basis, so I'm keeping that promise. I'm not going to break it. Anyways, for about 30-ish episodes of the show, it's kind of interesting how for that long I haven't talked about the Beatles. And honestly, what else can be said about them? They're considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest rock band of all time, and it's hard not to see a reason why. They've been influential in both songwriting and music production. Their their imagery has been iconic to the point of being mimicked and copied and paid homage to, and they have just as much a big place in pop culture as, say, Michael Jackson or Elvis Presley. And if it weren't for them, the world of music wouldn't be as it is today. Even if you're not a big music buff like I am, you'd still probably be familiar with the Fab Four, especially with albums like Abbey Road or Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. However, I want to talk about an album that came out just before Sgt. Pepper, and one I think kind of helped Sgt. Pepper be the album that we know it today. And it's fitting that this album has turned 55 years old, and that album happens to be simply called Revolver. Before we begin the album with Taxman, one of 3 songs of the album written by the guitarist himself, George Harrison, as well as sung by him as well. And boy is it a whopper of a start to this album. Taking a bit of some influence from the more hardcore aspects from 60s R&B styles, this one's more of a political satirical one, and a very clever one at that, and even if it is clearly a product of its time, lyrically. It seems to be a protest to how the Beatles have been being forced to pay a little overdue of taxes of almost about 90 to 95% of the Treasury to the Treasury and the then Prime Minister of the time, Harold Wilson, even name dropping him in one of the verses. George Harrison himself not only gives off this old, worn out, but still energetic approach to his vocals, but his guitars is utterly just kind of not, I wouldn't say thrashing, but still very very hardcore. It almost feels like a prototype to the conventional pop punk rock songs that would see from the 1970s, like Ramones, the Sex Pistols, or the Clash. And I wouldn't be surprised if something like those bands took a bit of influence from a song like this, not just musically but lyrically as well. And it is a good example of a political song being done right. It does so from a self-aware and a satirical point of view, from the point of view of the taxman himself, which, considering the sound of the song itself, it almost sounds like the name of a Batman villain or something, you know, which I should review this one. Anyways, it seems to show how the taxman doesn't really know what he would want with the money, as long as he just kind of gets it and just gives it to the government, I guess. Yeah, it doesn't really portray him as just one-sided or bad. It just kind of shows him as just someone who's kind of not considerate to other people. And I would like to hear more political songs and other media to have that somewhat ambiguity to it. Next is Eleanor Rigby, which is probably one of not only my favourite songs of this album, but probably one of my favourite Beatles songs out there. It is absolutely moody, eerie, yet also grand, and almost how minimal and simplistic it is. Essentially, it's basically a short Baroque inspired piece of just the vocals of Paul McCartney, some harmonious backing vocals from John Lennon and George Harrison, and an octet of stringed instruments of violins, violas, and cellos is absolutely. It's probably one of the more darker songs that the Beatles have ever done, and it's a great demonstration of the transition of being more than just a mere 60s rock or pop band, but something more artistic and experimental. And the lyrics are simply about lonely people, specifically about two characters named Eleanor Rigby and Father Mackenzie, and almost kind of develop some kind of short story about them. How Eleanor has a face by the job of a door, representing how she often keeps a smiling face in public to keep down her depression inside, while Father Mackenzie writes sermon after sermon every Sunday, every church service, but not a lot of people would go along to hear or attend it, almost representing the slow declining of religious influence in the United Kingdom in particular. Much like Taxman, it's kind of a reflection of what England were probably kind of going through at the time. The post-war depressions, or the high taxes, or just kind of the overall isolation from each other, which is still kind of relevant to this day, even after over half a century. And it's just and it's no wonder why it's one of my favorite Beatles songs of all time. It's not it's not a love song. It's not just guitars. It is something else entirely. And the way the strings just kind of do that, it almost kind of captures the monotonous, the kind of the tedium and the monotony of just modern life. And I think hearing that just kind of makes me think, did this kind of influence someone like Jeff Lynne of the Electric Light Orchestra when he came up with the idea for the Yellow Band, or maybe the kind of eerie rhythm kind of influenced Laurie Anderson and her "Oh Superman" song. It's kind of interesting how how distinctly different but yet eerily similar songs could make you think of each other and all that. Then we have "I'm Only Sleeping." Much like Eleanor Rigby and Taxman, this one it also has a very simple concept to its lyrics, being about a man who just kind of getting out of bed, still feeling exhausted, knackered, and tired. While George Harrison took the spotlight in Taxman and Paul McCartney and Eleanor Rigby, this time John Lennon takes the lead in vocals, while sharing acoustic guitars with George, while George himself plays some very interesting guitar solos that were recorded and played backwards, which is probably among the first times they actually experimented with backmasking, which is the technique of taking a recording of a vocal or an instrument and just, well, kind of reversing it and having it play backwards. And that's how we get a lot of the backmasked messages. This one, in here, it kind of fits the whole dreamy, kind of half-dazed as kind of vibe of this song. Plus, it also demonstrates the earliest transitions of how Beatles got into the more psychedelic side of their music, which will be further emphasized in albums such as Sgt. Pepper's Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine. So, to anyone who wants to kind of try to see how and where they kind of started developing the psychedelic sounds, I think this is among the songs that kind of started pioneering that. I would always call this proto-psychedelia. But aside from that, it still has a very simple, catchy, upbeat tone to it. and almost this kind of I don't care kind of attitude to Lennon's vocals. How people think he's lazy, but he thinks they're crazy. So is it better to be just all wild and energetic and crazy, and just using up all your energy, or is it just better to just lay back, kind of preserve your energy, and just kind of relax for a bit? Just take a chill, just chill every now and then, or maybe get stoned as demonstrated in the song itself. Well, many have said that this is also about a stoner or a druggie kind of going for a high and just kind of just taking full enjoyment in that, being in that high state of just kind of ecstasy, if you will. And if you like psychedelic rock music, or at least want to take a look at the earlier roots of it in general, this is one of the songs that are worth listening to. Next is Love You Too, the second of 3 songs off the Revolver album that are written primarily by George Harrison. And out of the 3 songs, this is one where I can definitely tell this was a George Harrison song. If you couldn't tell apart George Harrison's own vocals, you would definitely tell by the sitar that it was definitely written and composed by him. Because let me tell you, George Harrison, he loved the sitar. He loved Indian music in general during his lifetime. And I can't agree with the guy. I went to Sri Lanka myself and India. They make amazing music. That's why I'd say that's most of what I can say there. The sitar here is absolutely beautiful and just breathtaking. It almost sounds like the theme song to some old classic Bollywood film, as well as those tambla drums that kind of take place as the beat for this track. And the lyrics are much more minimalistic and therefore much more open to interpretation, probably more so than the previous track so far. It seems to go into George's desire for an immediate sexual relationship, but also a hope to open up our inner hedonism and just kind of accept life as it is, just kind of open ourselves and the world to each other. And if the previous song was kind of a foreshadow to the psychedelic music that Beatles would tap into, this definitely delves into it. And one or two of the lines that I feel a need to kind of bring up in particular are ones about how life is so short and love me while you still can before I become a dead old man. Even if it's not just kind of like an obvious joking nod to the whole Paul is dead conspiracy theory, which was somewhat going on at the time, it seems to be an unintentional foreshadowing to George Harrison's own tragic death in 2001, which is kind of harsh in hindsight, if anything. But regardless, this is still a beautiful and a very unique song from the Beatles discography alone. If you're a big fan of Bollywood music, or you love Indian music overall, you love their culture, or just kind of the dazzling, otherworldly sounds that their instruments make, this song alone is worth checking out. The next song, Here, There and Everywhere, is much like Eleanor Rigby, also written primarily by Paul McCartney and featuring his vocals. And unlike most of the previous songs, this one is definitely more of another love song and a very softer rock song, of course. And apparently it was inspired by the Beach Boys song God Only Knows from the Pet Sound album, which, according to Brian Wilson himself, was in itself inspired by the Beatles album Rubber Soul. So full circle, I guess. There's not a lot, not for me to talk about this one, at least compared to other songs of the album. It, but as is, it's still a very chill, very calming, soothing song that kind of feels like something from some of their previous albums, like Hard Day's Night or Help. It's not it's more just it's a simple song and it stays that simple. It doesn't try to be overblown or overcomplicated or too overproduced. It's just a simple song that Paul wants to make, and it stays that way. And you get that in the very soothing guitars and the serene drums of Ringo Starr, and as well as the very relaxed vocals of Paul himself. And just overall, it's a very calming and very soothing and very cute love song. In fact, according to some interviews, Paul McCartney himself considered this one of his personal favourite Beatles songs he ever made. And I kind of it may be maybe interesting to imagine so, but when you actually listen to it, it's kind of more easier to see why. It's very simple, and the lyrics themselves do offer how one can just can be just wants how the singer just wants to be with this other person here and now in the present, and always will commit and themselves and their life to this healthy and beautiful relationship all through to the foreseeable future. And it goes to show that while the Beatles may open up out of their comfort zone and do different things, they'll still occasionally do a simple love song here and there. And songs like this are just further proof of that, as well as something like When I'm 64 from the Sgt. Pepper album, which is also just as good as well, and the Sgt. Pepper album itself I'd probably look into sometime down the road. However, that brings us to probably the most well-known song of the album. Even if you don't know this album, you probably know the song I'm talking about. Yellow Submarine. And it's kind of not hard to see why this is probably one of the more well-known songs of the Revolver album, if not the Beatles discography overall. It's just so unique and just sticks out from even other distinct and different Beatles songs. This is, at heart, is essentially just a novelty song, just basically built around a sort of light-hearted and gimmicky concept about people who spend weird, exotic adventures in a very unique, well, yellow submarine. Something that is just as unique as the song itself. And this is also the only song of the album to be sung by Ringo Starr himself, even though this too has been written by Lennon and McCartney. And it's kind of no wonder why such a simple, weird, surreal, yet very catchy and very unforgettable song like this was somehow adapted into a full-length animated film in 1968. It's just something that even if you never really liked it at first, it's just something that sticks with you. And that's something that a song should do. It sticks with you, it makes you think about it, and the more you think about it, the more you may come to like it and enjoy it. And it doesn't try to be something serious or something deep. It's just meant to be a fun, catchy, very innocent, childlike song. And it's kind of emphasized in Ringo's almost innocent kind of storytelling kind of tone to his voice, as well as the lyrics, about how kind of like telling a little story, an old pastime story about how he and some old friends of his would, of course, go around the world in this, well, titular yellow submarine, possibly to Pepperland if the movie is anything to go by. And there's little unique kind of fun things that kind of feel 60s but still feel timeless, like that little brass band bit, which kind of makes me think of those old 60s musicals like Mary Poppins, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, Sound of Music, or even, I don't know, Bed Knobs and Broomsticks. And in the middle eight bit, there's all the weird sound effects and all these distorted vocals that make it sound like the ongoings and all the crazy processes of being inside of a submarine. And overall, it's just a very simple and fun, catchy song. And if you got kids and if you want to introduce them to the Beatles, this is probably one of the first songs I would probably recommend to them. Side 1 ends with She Said, She Said. Kind of differing from the light-hearted novelty of Yellow Submarine and going back to the semi-psychedelicness of, say, Love You Too or Taxman or even Here, There and Everywhere. This one was primarily written by Lennon with some assistance by Harrison, and Lennon himself does full vocals and George does both electric and bass due to McCartney himself kind of having a bit of a creative difference over the structure of the song itself apparently, which meant he had no involvement in the song whatsoever. But as is, I think George kind of did well in the meantime with the bass, and there's even a bit of the Hammond organs played by John Lennon himself. In terms of the lyrics, it was apparently inspired by an interesting experience under a particular LSD trip, particularly comments made by one familiar actor, the late great Peter Fonda. Under this trip, he recalled how he had a bit of an injury during his childhood, and he said to John, "I know what it's like to be dead." And hearing that just kind of inspired Lennon to write a song about it, about how people seem to think they know what it's like to go through hardships and stress or even death itself. And this kind of makes the singer feel somewhat insignificant, almost having a bit of an existential crisis. And the music itself kind of emphasizes it a bit. Not only is it psychedelic, it almost feels kind of uncertain, almost not entirely off key, but definitely have this almost intentionally offish tone. And while it's not exactly a love song, it's more of a you don't know what it's like, look, I know what it's like. It kind of the lyrics can be kind of summed up in that kind of vibe, and overall is another demonstration of how the Beatles transitioned into the more psychedelic rock styles that they would do later with stuff like Abbey Road and Sgt. Pepper.